give a warm round of applause to Jonathan MacDonald.
I'm wondering whether or not the way that we look at data is more important than the data itself, the lenses in which we actually see things through. I remember when I was very young, at 27 years old, and I was the chairman of the British music industry, and the data that we were looking at was that Napster and MP3.com and Kazaa were basically stealing our revenue. These damn pesky pirate file sharers who were giving music, and we were on a high. We were the third largest contributor to the GDP of the UK at that time. So the last thing we wanted was someone to come along and just give away the thing that we were able to expense Porsches because of to anyone else online. Right? And so at the late 90s, as I became the chairman, my committee, which comprised the chief exec of EMI, a couple of the people from Virgin Island Records, we decided to sue the internet. And it was a great move because, well, it wasn't actually that great a move if you think about it historically, but it was a great move at the time. It seemed like we hired a lot of very expensive consultants who spoke for way too long about stuff that we actually kind of already knew. But the reality was the outcome, we sent a 160-page fax to someone who we believed to be the chief exec of the internet. Do you remember faxes? So yeah, my daughter thinks that LPs are where I used to store my downloads. I don't know what that might mean. Oh. So anyway, we sent a 160-page fax to the chief exec of the internet. 7 years later, I'm working on a consulting project for a large advertising agency, and I get escorted down to meet the chief exec of this French advertising agency called Publicis. I'm sure you know about them. And we went downstairs to restaurant 161. And I said to Dominique, the lovely small French girl with this annoying kind of twitch, that I eventually realised she was actually winking at me. We walk into the restaurant, and I said, why is it called Restaurant 161? And she said, because, believe it or not, the chief exec 7 years ago received a 161-page fax accusing him of being the chief exec of the internet. And I was like, what loser would have sent that? And then rapidly went to the 161st page to see if my signature was on it, which it wasn't, thank God. But it's interesting that the data we looked at, the lens in which we looked at the data through, was that this was a massive, massive risk. It was something which was red flagged as much as anything could be a red flag. What we should have done is invented iTunes or Spotify. If Nokia really was connecting people, they'd invented Facebook, right? If Kodak really was around sharing memories, they'd have invented Instagram, okay? We believe this. It's just interesting how the companies inside an industry tend to not be the companies that innovate inside the industry, which needs to be innovated within. Or something shorter than that if I worked in advertising. But it's interesting that the three things that we should have done are the same three things that for the last 24 years in business, I've noticed that companies don't tend to do. And it applies even more so in IT, and even more so than IT inside our data environment that we're in. And these three things are absolutely critical to how we can actually, using the data landscape and the IT landscape, accelerate into the future. And the first one is using perpetual change as fuel. And the second one is calculating what would disrupt us next. And the third is understanding the business we're really in. To move swiftly on, to keep within my allotted 15 minutes, I think one of the things that's quite important to understand, and we all already know, is that everyone online is connected to an average of 120 people. Which means that the second tier reach of each individual in life, regardless of if it's B2B or B2C, is 14,400. All of us are 3 away from 1.728 million, which is 120 by 120 by 120. And we get all this big data stuff. We know there's so much information. But what does that also mean in contrast to what's been said in terms of how much people lie or rather misappropriate their real personalities? The actual reality of it all is that everyone who has a profile online actually has around 3 profiles. The reality is that this has led to massive, massive changes in the environment, and understanding these modern contexts is critical. So if we look at the data as a brand, for instance, and I'm taking this from the marketing context as well, just to represent the non-IT bit. Looking at it from the brand context, a brand will look at Google search trends and then buy search terms against. That's a lens in which they look at some data. Some of your companies that you deal with, and maybe your company as well, will look at how many times a day your site gets hit, or how many sales reps sell a certain amount of product at a certain time. But what we don't necessarily see the data that we aren't presented with. And there's 1% of stuff we know, 1% of stuff we know we don't know, and 98% of stuff we don't know. So who's seen this film, The Wolf of Wall Street? Hands up. So it's a fantastic scene where our main character has taken 4 Quaaludes, which are out of date. Quaaludes, by the way, anyone here over the age of 40 will probably remember it. Anyone under the age of 40, they were really cool, well not cool because the drugs are bad, but they were a very, very niche drug that was around in the 70s and 80s. They're just continued now. But in this amazing film where our character has taken these Quaaludes, he starts overdosing and frothing at the mouth, and in this scene where he's trying to get into his Lamborghini, it's probably the best ever advert for not taking drugs I've ever seen in my life. However, the very next day from the film release, the highest search engine result on Google was this. It depends on the lens in which we see data through, because there isn't one brand in the world that actually looked at the film content linked to what people were searching for. Because a lot of companies, especially from a marketing perspective, will view it through what they think people are interested in, because they've asked market research companies to find out answers for questions. I remember working in mobile advertising back in the day, and we used to say to people, hey, would you like adverts on your mobile? 100% no. If we gave you £10 per advert, would you say yes? 78% said yes. So we're like, awesome, mobile advertising for the win, right? It's the lens that we look through. Yeah, it's an incredible world we live in. When we look around this context, understanding the context in which we're actually dealing within, for sure we're dealing within peer-to-peer cryptocurrency worlds, but that's not the key. Underlying that is blockchain, which I'm sure you're totally aware of. It's a totally digital, transparent, public ledger of transactions, which means that the entire legal and financial services industry is already disrupted, it just doesn't realize it is. I'm interested in how we look at interfaces and the data that we think needs to be presented on a screen, where the reality is the innovations are happening with data presented in thin air. These machines and screens that we have are belying the fact that by 2025, the average size of a computer chip will be the size of a blood cell, and it will be 1 billion times more capable than today. Pieces of plastic and metal are totally and utterly obsolete already. We just don't see it. As are physical relationships. This is Love Plus in Japan, a company that's doing it right. It's doing it good with data. You're allowed to take your virtual girlfriend to Love Plus. This is a guy taking a picture of his friend's virtual girlfriend that you can only see through the screen. The irony is the other side of that hedge is a nudist beach. But they don't care, because it turns out that 17% of men in Japan would prefer to have a virtual girlfriend than a real girlfriend. And I've heard, and I can't substantiate, that 98% of women in Japan feel the same in reverse. But I find it interesting how that also, if we look at the modern context changing in which data is playing such an amazing role, you can have a concert where the guy on the left-hand side, Snoop Dogg, is still alive, the guy on the right-hand side is dead and has been for 20 years, Tupac Shakur. And yet they have a concert together, one of them is a hologram, the other one isn't. And people pay money to go to that. This is using data from recorded footage, and I'm sure this is just a GIF. I'm sure the dance moves involve more than just this one move. This haptic holographics is something next. How data is used in terms of imagery and the ability to actually feel and touch holograms means that the next concert that happens involving Tupac Shakur, who's actually dead, will have a meet and greet afterwards with him shaking hands with fans. This is how good can come from data. It's interesting how Proteus Digital Health are smashing it in terms of ability to ingest a digital pill that tells you what's wrong with you. I want you to think about the entire medical profession under that context. Bearing in mind, right now, you can go and buy this from proteusdigitalhealth.com, and yes, they accept PayPal. What I suggest we do in terms of looking at this opportunity, this is all good, cool stuff, but how can we actually leverage this inside IT? I suggest we can apply it to mess. Similarly to what some of the previous people called the same name have said, but I think we can look at it practically. Look at hotel check-ins. How can we apply what we know could be possible to hotel check-ins? How could the mess that's switching mobile operators that was mentioned be solved using the tools that we all already have? How could it change the fact that most people can't remember passwords? And if they do buy into a tool like LastPass, it is now commonly known from the last 5 days as LostPass, hence the fact it's been hacked. How do we change the way that accounting's done? And even with the beautiful solutions like Xero, the reality is that reconciling that OK button in the middle of the screen is a massive pain in the ass. How about getting onto the Wi-Fi connection here? Tried it? Everything is a mess. And if we look at queues, toilet door handles. Why should we touch a toilet door handle? All I see is mess which data and IT could solve. We have an absolute land of opportunity. The next point is calculating what would disrupt us next. I remember an amazing conversation with the companies that I was working with in 2003, 2004, with their 5-year and 10-year business plans. There was this large South Korean technology provider, who I won't mention. You can imagine who they are, and they make these kind of phones now. Well, actually, this phone right now. And they had a 300-year business plan. And the reality is that we tend to plan in a linear way. This is all about calculating what will disrupt us next. So we tend to plan in a linear way, but change actually happens exponentially, as we know. And the delta between our linear plan and the exponential change growth is disruption. And that's what happens. And if we look at it in terms of a DNA structure disruption, it starts with a fundamental change in the consumption, the production, or the manufacturing of anything. The next thing that happens is a low perceived threat rating, like instantaneous low perceived threat rating. So I say to people, hey, what do you think about blockchain technology to like a range of banks? And they'll say, oh yeah, we'll regulate the hell out of that. I'm like, oh, so you see a low threat rating, which means that when the last part happens in terms of our chart, we end up in a situation where there's an inflection point into the mainstream and you're really stuffed. Speaking of e-cigarettes, and I know barged past it, I just want to pause on this point. Honlick in 2003, this is Honlick, in 2003 released a range of patents, and it went to Philip Morris, Imperial Tobacco, British American Tobacco, and the patents were around a cigarette that didn't actually burn anything. It glowed, but it had just nicotine and glycerine inside it, but none of the other carcinogens such as strychnine and carbon monoxide and these beautiful chemicals that we all buy into. And all of the tobacco companies were totally disinterested. And now all of them pay between $100 and $178 million per quarter to build on the e-cigarette license. My question to you, just to pause on this, to take a liberty of an extra 60 seconds, if you allow, is to ask you whether or not you have considered what is your e-cigarette. From anything I've covered. And I do these for 1-hour talks, 3-hour talks, 9-hour talks, and 3-day workshops. I only have 15 minutes now, but this is just a question that you could consider in your own head. I've planted what I could plant. Understanding what business we're really in is my final point. And this is critical. The companies that are doing well have done all three of these things. The main thing, I think, is to keep the main thing the main thing. If you calculate what is actually your main thing, Wonder Bra aren't in the business of lingerie. They're in the business of self-confidence. Harley Davidson isn't in the business of making motorcycles. They're in the business of enabling freedom for middle-aged men like me. The reality is that we all have a main thing. If we look at Airbnb, it's not about rental of your free space. It's actually linking surplus to demand through accessibility. If we look at Kickstarter, despite the fact that you could look at this and say, yeah, hell, I'll invest $8 million into an Exploding Kittens card game, the reality is that Kickstarter is actually linking belief to production through investment. What's your main thing? If we look at these amazing innovations from around the world, this, I think, is a stroke of genius. I'm sure you're asking, wow, where can I buy one? You're also saying, maybe I could tell you that actually you can make one of these things on the screen, and I'm not going to draw you a diagram. But if you look carefully, this is linking behavior to purpose through design. If we look at this, the Lego Strip Club, fantastic innovation, probably never been seen as well. And I could give you the website for it. You're probably thinking, how can she be that good a stripper because she can't bend her legs? The reality is, this, if we look at the main thing, I'm talking about the unlocking the main thing. What's the main thing that you see here? Because I see that this is linking inspiration to innovation through alteration of the existing model. What's your main thing? How much do you understand what's going on around you in the modern context? How much do you understand what would really disrupt you? What's your e-cigarette? What business are you really in? They're my three things. And ultimately, I would like to also posit that we should only build the future that we want. Otherwise, what's happening, especially in data and especially in technology, is that we are using the escape ladder steps as firewood. Using perpetual change as fuel in the modern context. Calculating what would disrupt us next. Understanding what business we're really in. Thank you.